By the end of this video, you'll understand how a simple observation, made far from any laboratory or university, quietly exposed a belief that American farmers in Iowa had trusted for decades during the 1940s. At the time, crop failure was widely accepted as unavoidable under certain conditions. Farmers believed that poor yields were the natural limit of the land itself, reinforced by experience, tradition, and the pressure of wartime production. But one detail, noticed not by an expert or official, did not fit this explanation. And once it was seen clearly, the belief could no longer hold. This is the story of how an ordinary moment on an Iowa farm revealed that the problem was not the soil, but the assumptions surrounding it. To understand why this moment mattered, it's important to understand what Iowa farmers believed at the time, and why that belief felt reasonable. In the 1940s, farming in the American Midwest was shaped by necessity. The country was at war. Food production was critical. Farmers relied on methods that had sustained them through previous decades, often passed down through family practice rather than formal instruction. When crops failed or yields declined, the explanation seemed straightforward. The land had limits. Certain soils were simply less productive. Weather patterns, exhaustion of nutrients, or natural constraints were seen as unavoidable realities of farming life. This belief was not controversial. It was practical. It aligned with experience and reinforced caution. Experimentation carried risk, and during wartime, risk felt irresponsible. The assumption became routine. Some fields would underperform, and nothing meaningful could be done about it. This belief endured because it fit comfortably within daily farming practice. Farmers trusted what they could see over time. If the same fields produced similar results year after year, the conclusion felt obvious. There was little reason to question methods that had worked well enough in the past. Agricultural advice at the time emphasized consistency and efficiency. Changing long-standing practices was often discouraged unless failure was severe. And in many cases, failure was explained as inevitable rather than solvable. The belief did not rely on official enforcement. It relied on repetition, tradition, and the shared understanding of what farming life demanded. Accepting these limits reduced uncertainty. It allowed farmers to plan, endure losses, and move forward without questioning the foundations of their work. Importantly, there was no obvious contradiction early on. Fields were planted as they always had been. Yields matched expectations. Losses were attributed to known factors. Nothing demanded immediate reconsideration. The belief persisted, not because it was proven repeatedly, but because nothing appeared to disprove it. And so it remained intact. Until one small observation introduced a possibility that farmers had not considered and could no longer ignore. In rural Iowa during the 1940s, farming knowledge was shaped less by formal study and more by lived experience. What farmers trusted most was what had worked before. Techniques were passed down through families, reinforced by neighbors, and refined slowly over time. When a method produced reliable yields, it became accepted practice. When it failed, the explanation was often attributed to factors beyond control: weather, soil exhaustion, or natural limits. These explanations were not questioned because they matched what farmers had already observed across many seasons. Experience, repeated year after year, became authority. The context of World War II further reinforced this mindset. Food production was not optional. Farms were under pressure to meet quotas, supply troops, and support the broader war effort. In this environment, experimentation carried risk. A failed attempt at a new method could mean lost yield at a time when loss was unacceptable. Stability mattered more than optimization. Farmers were encouraged, both formally and informally, to rely on methods that were predictable, even if they were inefficient. Trying something unfamiliar was seen as unnecessary when existing explanations already accounted for success and failure. The belief that poor yields were inevitable under certain conditions allowed farmers to accept loss without jeopardizing broader stability. Another reason the belief endured was its simplicity. The explanation did not require technical understanding. It did not demand complex analysis. It offered a clear cause, land limitations, and a clear outcome, reduced yield. This clarity made it easy to accept and difficult to challenge. Inherited explanations are powerful because they feel settled. When a belief has been shared across generations, questioning it can feel like questioning the judgment of those who came before. In farming communities where continuity mattered, this carried emotional weight. The belief was not just practical, it was cultural. Outside perspectives were rare. During this period, agricultural research existed, but its reach into rural communities was uneven. Many farmers relied more on local knowledge than on distant institutions. Advice from outside the community was often met with caution, especially if it contradicted established practice. Without sustained challenge, beliefs hardened. If yields declined gradually rather than catastrophically, there was little incentive to re-examine assumptions. The belief persisted because it explained reality well enough to avoid scrutiny. Most importantly, nothing about daily farm life demanded reconsideration. The belief aligned with routine outcomes. Losses occurred where expected. Success appeared where effort was applied. The system functioned. Questioning the belief would have required effort, uncertainty, and risk, with no obvious reward. In a time defined by external pressures, stability took precedence over curiosity. And so the belief held, not because it was aggressively defended, but because it was never meaningfully tested. Although the belief remained intact, the land itself was offering quiet signals that something was off. Some fields consistently underperformed even when weather conditions were favorable. Others responded unevenly to the same treatment applied across neighboring plots. These inconsistencies were noted but rarely examined closely. They were treated as quirks of the land. Farmers had long accepted that not all soil behaved the same way. Minor variation was expected, and variation that didn't disrupt overall production was easy to overlook. The belief absorbed these inconsistencies without strain. In certain areas, yields declined despite unchanged practices. Fertilizer use remained consistent. Planting schedules were familiar, equipment was maintained, and yet the outcome differed from expectations. Rather than triggering investigation, these differences were explained away. Weather was blamed even when conditions were similar across fields. Soil exhaustion was cited even when crop rotation had been followed. Inheritance of bad land was assumed, even when no clear boundary marked where productivity should drop. These explanations were plausible enough to avoid scrutiny. The key reason these details failed to challenge the belief was scale. The losses were gradual. The inconsistencies were modest. Nothing collapsed suddenly. Nothing forced a reckoning. When a system fails slowly, it rarely invites urgency. As long as farms remained operational and food production continued, there was little incentive to question foundational assumptions. The belief remained useful, even if imperfect. Familiar explanations carry psychological comfort. They reduce uncertainty. They protect against the discomfort of not knowing. And they allow people to move forward without revisiting decisions already made. For farmers facing daily physical labor and wartime pressure, reassessing basic assumptions would have added mental strain with no guarantee of improvement. It was easier to accept imperfection than to question certainty. Over time, routine became a filter. Anything that fit the belief passed through unnoticed. Anything that didn't was softened, reinterpreted, or dismissed. This wasn't denial, it was efficiency. Human systems are designed to preserve what works well enough. In this case, the belief survived not because it was flawless, but because the cost of challenging it felt higher than the cost of living with it. Still, the unanswered questions did not disappear. They accumulated quietly. Each unexplained inconsistency added weight. Each rationalization required a little more effort. The belief remained intact, but it was becoming heavier, less flexible, more strained. Nothing had broken it yet, but the conditions for collapse were forming. The moment that challenged the belief did not come from a farmer, an official, or an agricultural expert. It came from someone with no stake in local tradition. During the 1940s, prisoners of war were sometimes assigned to farm labor in the American Midwest. Their work was practical and supervised. They were expected to follow instructions, not question methods. This particular prisoner was placed into the routine of farm work, plowing, planting, tending fields, without context for why things were done the way they were. And because he had no history with the land, he also had no assumptions to protect. As the work repeated, the POW began to notice something that the farmers no longer saw. Certain fields consistently produced weaker results, even when treated the same way as others. The pattern wasn't random. It followed a logic that did not align with the explanation farmers had relied on. What stood out was not the soil itself, but how it was being used. From the perspective of someone trained elsewhere, the arrangement of crops, spacing, and rotation appeared inefficient. Practices that felt natural to the farmers stood out as avoidable constraints. This was not insight born from theory. It was recognition born from comparison. The critical shift occurred when the POW framed the problem differently. Instead of asking why the land was failing, he noticed how the land was being worked. Instead of accepting soil limitation as the cause, he recognized a pattern of use that restricted productivity. The observation was simple. The land wasn't inherently poor. It was being limited by assumption. This reframing mattered because it redirected attention away from inevitability and toward method. And once the question changed, the belief could no longer stand. At first, the observation was met with hesitation. It did not come from authority, it did not align with tradition, and it came from someone outside the farming community. But what made it difficult to dismiss was its clarity. When tested informally, through small adjustments or comparison, the results contradicted expectations. The same land responded differently under slightly altered conditions. The explanation farmers had relied on began to fail under direct observation. No argument was needed. The evidence emerged through practice. The belief did not collapse in a single announcement or confrontation. It collapsed through recognition. Once farmers saw that productivity changed when assumptions were adjusted, the old explanation lost its usefulness. It could no longer explain what was happening in front of them. The myth of an inevitable soil limitation gave way to a quieter realization. The problem had never been the land itself. It had been the way the land was understood. This collapse was not emotional. There was no celebration, no acknowledgement of error, no formal rejection of the old belief. Instead, there was adjustment. Practices shifted, expectations changed, and the belief that had once felt unquestionable quietly receded, no longer needed. The collapse occurred not because the belief was attacked, but because it no longer fit reality. Even after the belief lost its explanatory power, change did not arrive immediately. The realization that the land could respond differently did not erase decades of habit. Farmers had relied on established practices not because they were perfect, but because they were familiar and predictable. Abandoning them required trust in outcomes that had not yet been proven over time. Initial reactions were cautious. The old belief no longer explained results, but it still shaped instinct. Adjustments were considered carefully, often in limited scope, and without formal acknowledgement that anything fundamental had been wrong. The collapse of belief created uncertainty before it created opportunity. Rather than broad reform, change began with small trials. Fields were treated differently in isolated areas. Spacing was adjusted. Rotation patterns were altered. These changes were modest, almost tentative, and often framed as temporary tests rather than permanent shifts. The results were difficult to ignore. Under altered methods, productivity improved in places where decline had once been assumed inevitable. The land responded not dramatically but consistently. Each outcome added weight to the new understanding. What had been seen as limitation revealed itself as misapplication. As evidence accumulated, the tension between tradition and observation became unavoidable. The old belief had provided certainty. The new understanding demanded attentiveness. It required farmers to see their land not as fixed, but as responsive, capable of improvement under different conditions. This shift did not invalidate past experience, but it reframed it. Losses once attributed to soil were now understood as signals, not endpoints. Still, the transition was uneven. Not every farmer adjusted at the same pace. Some adopted new practices quietly, others observed from a distance before committing. Change spread through observation, not persuasion. Notably, the belief was never formally renounced. There were no announcements declaring the old explanation incorrect, no manuals rewritten overnight, no acknowledgement that a long-held assumption had failed. Instead, the belief faded through disuse. As practices changed, the explanation that once justified them became irrelevant. It was not replaced by a new myth. It was simply no longer needed. This quiet transition allowed continuity. Farmers could adjust without confronting the discomfort of having been wrong. The most immediate consequence was practical improvement. Yields stabilized. Losses declined. Confidence returned, not in inevitability, but in adaptability. The land was no longer seen as a fixed constraint, but as a system that responded to understanding. Yet the source of this shift was rarely emphasized. The observation that had triggered change remained secondary to the results themselves. The focus stayed on what worked, not on why beliefs had failed. The system moved forward without revisiting its assumptions explicitly. There was no moment of triumph. The belief had not collapsed dramatically enough to invite recognition. It had simply stopped being useful. Farmers continued working, fields were planted, seasons passed. The change embedded itself into routine, becoming the new normal. And just as the old belief had once persisted through repetition, the new understanding took hold the same way. Quietly, practically, without ceremony. The collapse of the farming myth revealed how easily practical assumptions can become unquestioned truths. The belief that the land itself imposed unavoidable limits did not persist because it was tested repeatedly. It persisted because it was convenient. It offered a simple explanation for loss and required no further investigation. Once accepted, the belief shaped how farmers interpreted every outcome. Poor yields confirmed it. Average yields reinforced it. Even improvement elsewhere was seen as an exception rather than evidence. The myth survived because it organized experience, not because it explained it fully. Another revelation lay in the role of routine. When practices are repeated long enough, they become invisible. The question shifts from, is this working, to this is how it's done. Routine provides efficiency, but it can also obscure alternatives. In this case, routine masked inefficiency. Methods that limited productivity felt natural simply because they were familiar. Over time, familiarity replaced evaluation. The belief did not require defense. Routine defended it automatically. The story also revealed why the belief was most vulnerable to an outsider's perspective. Those embedded within a system adapt to its constraints. They learn how to work around limitations rather than question their source. Outsiders, lacking this adaptation, notice patterns more clearly. The POW was not bound by local tradition or inherited explanation. He did not need to preserve existing assumptions. His observation carried no obligation to protect the belief. This distance allowed him to see the problem not as inevitable, but as conditional. The collapse demonstrated the limits of explanation without experience. As long as the belief remained theoretical, it could absorb contradiction. But once direct experience contradicted it, through observable changes in yield, the belief lost relevance. No argument was required. No authority needed to intervene. Reality performed the evaluation. The shift did not represent a rejection of farming tradition. It represented refinement. Farmers did not abandon experience. They reinterpreted it. Losses once accepted as unavoidable were now seen as signals pointing toward method rather than fate. This reframing altered how land was understood, not as fixed, but as responsive. The collapse revealed that beliefs tied too closely to habit can persist long after they stop serving reality. Finally, the story revealed how meaningful change often occurs quietly. There was no public reckoning, no declaration that the myth had been false. The belief simply faded as it lost utility. Structural change rarely announces itself. It embeds itself into routine, becoming invisible once again. The myth did not end with acknowledgement. It ended with irrelevance. After the farming myth lost its usefulness, life did not pause to mark the moment. Fields continued to be planted. Seasons continued to pass. The work remained demanding, repetitive, and uncertain. What changed was not the rhythm of farming life, but the understanding beneath it. The belief that poor yields were an unavoidable fact of the land quietly disappeared from daily explanation. It was no longer referenced, defended, or relied upon. It simply stopped being mentioned. There was no official acknowledgement that a long-held assumption had failed. The belief was not replaced with a declaration or a new doctrine. Instead, it was bypassed. Farmers adjusted practices based on what they now observed, without revisiting the explanation that once justified inaction. This silence allowed continuity. It avoided the discomfort of admitting error, and it let change take place without conflict. The myth ended not with correction, but with neglect. Over time, the observation that sparked change became absorbed into routine. Methods evolved. Expectations shifted. Fields were treated with greater attention to how they responded rather than how they were assumed to behave. The source of the insight, the moment of observation itself, faded from memory. What remained was the practice. The lesson lived on not as a story, but as habit. This story matters not because it transformed farming overnight, but because it reveals how belief systems quietly shape decision-making. The myth endured because it simplified complexity and reduced uncertainty. It collapsed when experience made that simplification impossible to maintain. No argument overturned it. No authority dismantled it. It ended when observation reframed the problem. The observation that changed Iowa farming practices in the 1940s was not remarkable in itself. What made it consequential was the belief it displaced. This story is a reminder that many assumptions persist, not because they are true, but because they feel settled, and that change often begins not with new ideas, but with noticing what has been overlooked. The belief did not fall loudly. It quietly stopped explaining the world.